Let's get this show on the road, shall we? So, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the AACE Bruce County Local Section Technical Event for the 6th of May, 2021. Who would have believed a year later we're still doing virtual get-togethers? Hopefully soon we'll be able to actually see each other. But in saying that, it's still great to get everybody to here. It's great to have everybody on. We have 20 people on now. I'm sure others will join as the evening goes on. And we did have 44 people register, so maybe some of those people are going to be looking for the video recording. I will be recording tonight's presentation by Shoshanna, and it will be made available to all participants via YouTube, a private YouTube link within the next 48 to 72 hours once I get it processed. So, without further ado, we're gonna start this evening's events. We're gonna welcome Shoshanna Fraizinger, who's going to be presenting for us tonight on the estimating for cost control, navigating the sea of change. So it's going to be an interesting evening. I would just personally like to congratulate Shoshana on being voted as the president-elect for ACE starting in June. I think you get sworn in or whatever you have to do when you go and do that. So congratulations to her. So she's going to be the incoming president of our association here. So congratulations to you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. So I am I'm going to jump right into it and uh, share my screen. And of course, I know how to do that because we practiced. There we go. So the subject of today's paper, and I would love all of the feedback from this because, as I mentioned before, some of you may or may not have joined. You're my guinea pig audience for this paper that is being presented live at this year's virtual conference. So any constructive criticism as to the presentation is absolutely welcome, and I really appreciate that the Bruce County local section lets me use them as my sandbox for practicing. This topic came about actually from conversations during the cost estimating technical subcommittee meetings at last year's conference when we were looking for subjects of particular papers that we would like to see come out in industry. And of course, if you've never joined a technical subcommittee meeting before, I suggest you do if you're interested in an area. There's always some good philosophical discussion that comes up, and of course, it's another way to sort of share industry knowledge and concerns and issues, and get some feedback from those in our profession. So this came up, change management from the perspective of cost estimating, and of course, it was cost estimators talking, but when we talk about estimating also applies to schedules. We don't just estimate the cost of our projects, we also estimate the duration of our projects. So a lot of the conversations that we have in the cost estimating world also apply to the planning and scheduling world. However, most of them don't necessarily admit it right off the bat. A little bit about me that hasn't already been said. I'm currently a project manager with Sarge and Lundy, but I also own my own consulting company. I am the president-elect coming in. I'm currently sitting as the VP of Education on the big board and representing the associate board as the chair. I'm the past president of the local section and the past treasurer for Region 1. Civil engineering structural degree, member of CII project controls, community of business advancement, I think is the actual acronym there. I can never remember. It's very long, but essentially we talk about project controls. And I'm a member of WIN Canada, and 23 plus years in engineering and projects, primarily in nuclear. Something you don't know about me, I paint, and my brother put up a little website for me, which is pretty cool. I don't maintain it nearly as well as I should have. So let's talk about what it is we're actually here to talk about. Enough about me. the conversation that we had during this technical subcommittee meeting was really the concept of change from the perspective of the estimator and in the context of the cost estimating process. So what kind of change management issues do we have within estimating? And this prompted me to actually produce a survey and send it out to a number of avenues and arenas to get some actual feedback from other professionals. So the survey will present the 8 questions, some qualitative, some quantitative, and the results with respect to change and estimating. And then taking a look, as we are in our plan, do, check kind of framework and trying to apply lessons learned from other areas, we have change management processes in the total cost management framework. And there is actually a recommended practice 100R19, which is change management for contract management. And so we're going to kind of look at recommendations and observations from just general experience, as well as the study responses and what we can take away from contract management, change management recommended practices and apply in cost estimating. So in a nutshell, between that point in time in our business planning, our strategic planning, when the decision has been made to initiate a project, and that period of time when we actually turn the asset over to operations, our understanding of what's happening in the project, scope, execution, is continually evolving as we get new and better inputs through the work of the integrated project team. And those updated inputs are going to inform the decisions that are being made by project management and executive management and the organization's management with respect to whether or not that project is still a reasonable business decision to continue. And it's always in that context of business planning that we have to think about what it is we're doing, because ultimately companies don't just spend money for the sake of spending money. They want to spend money to achieve a strategic objective and meet that return on investment, right? Whatever that objective is. So and all of these new inputs will affect the cost estimate and the schedule, right? We're talking about what kind of contracting methods we might be employing. We're talking about whether or not we have resources available, and that's money, time, and people. What kind of procurement requirements we might have, what kind of scheduling constraints and planning assumptions, our organizational maturity. Do we have the A project team? Do we have the B project team? Do we have the, I don't know what letter project team? All of these things are going to change the risk profile of our project and the decisions that the project team is going to make with respect to moving this project forward. And of course, all of that happens in the context of the risk appetite of the organization. So for those who don't spend a lot of time living in the cost estimating world, it's basically a 6-step workflow. We start with collecting and analyzing that project documentation, which is going to inform the cost estimate. And that documentation that is being produced by the project team is ultimately going to be the input that's going to be used by the estimator to quantify the costs against specific estimate line items that are going to describe the elements required to execute the project scope. The quality of those inputs and the quality of the quantification, how well we actually achieve doing steps 1 and 2 is going to be based on the maturity and quality of the input data, the assumptions that the estimator might have to kind of fill in the gaps with respect to the understanding of scope and execution, and the precision with which the methodology is being applied to develop those quantified costs. Once we've got steps 1 and 2 done, The estimator is then going to classify those costs against requirements typically specified in the estimate classification RPs. The generic one is 17R97, but we have a number of industry-specific variants. In nuclear, we use 18R97. And then they're going to document the costs and the basis of those costs so that the estimate can be reviewed and validated and then presented either to management if we're an owner, or to the client in the case of a vendor. And how well we do steps 5 and 6 are going to depend on how well we did steps 3 and 4. So in all avenues, the maturity of the inputs, the assumptions that we make, the precision that we're doing this affects the final output. So let's put this 6-step process workflow into perspective of the bigger picture, because estimating is kind of like a little project within a project. It's a cog in a much larger machine of capital project planning and progression. So we start with scope development and our business planning, and we iterate that first estimate. And as we're doing that, we're really getting to our WBS, we're doing some alternatives analysis, we're going to do some additional iterations, and then we're going to get some risk profiling and assessment as we get engineering and contract strategy development. We're going to iterate again, and then we're going to hit a performance baseline at some point before we get to execution. And from there, we're going to do all of our progress and performance measurement, our contract change management as we understand it, and our contingency management. So when we're talking about the guidance that applies to everything, in the first 3 iterations, our scope definition guidance comes from 17R97 cost estimate classification, 34R05 basis of estimate. Our deliverables in the process for the quality assurance of this estimate process is going to come from 31R03 and 11020 cost estimate validation. And the planning guidance is going to come from 35R09, developing the cost estimate plan. But we also have a couple of new RPs with respect to planning, which are kind of important. 105 19, which is estimate requirements document, and 106-19, which is the development of the cost estimate basis. And that is, let's equate that to the project work plan or the project management plan for the estimate. And then we've got the execution guidance, which is 59R10, the development of factored cost estimates, etc. But the important point here is, when we think about change management, we typically assume that it kicks in for the project once we've set our performance management baseline. And we can take a look at this from another lens. If we take a look at it from the phase gate process, because oftentimes that general project planning process flow gets flipped into a gate process. And that gate process will be slightly different in different industries and organizations, because they're applying the guidance provided in those recommended practices according to their own interpretations. And their own interpretations are generally aligned with their specific governance and work processes. The conundrum here is the way those companies actually implement and execute their processes may be slightly not necessarily equal in depth, breadth, or quality of the intent and execution expected in those guidance recommended practices. The situation becomes even more complicated when you look at the traditional approach to how project teams interface with their estimating support, because there is an inherent lag leading into the estimator's activities for the development of that cost estimate to support each management gate or change order during execution. The project team requires a significant amount of time at the beginning of that phase gate to plan and develop the inputs to a sufficient level of maturity within the phase to turn those documents over to the estimator as for inputs. The problem is the estimate is also going to be presented at the gate. So the estimator is faced with this kind of last out of the gate kind of situation from a schedule progression perspective, but they've always got to meet that same finish date as the rest of the project team. Decidedly disadvantaged position to be in, because as an estimator, we have to quickly turn around the assessment of the project inputs, which are often still in a state of flux because the project team is still progressing work to try and mature things and figure things out and make decisions. And then they've got to assemble an estimate in a coherent and quality way using appropriate quantification methodologies, and then present it with the right classification and risk profile. And again, from the perspective of the gated process lens, this is typically where we would say change management would kick in for the project, right? Again, this is generally the performance management baseline. So how do we as estimators, we've got a couple of we've got a couple of questions that we need to ask ourselves. What should an estimator do to ensure their estimates are as current to the approved documented project definition, while limiting the potential cycling as scope and execution and contracting strategies and everything keep maturing within the rest of the project? And what happens when there's a disconnect between the expectations in the guidance provided and the project controls governance that's implemented? And what happens when there's no transparent estimate change management and control process to support the estimates production? As estimators, we need to ask ourselves those questions. And as project team members, we need to ask ourselves those questions, because it's not the estimator's estimate, it's not the project manager's estimate, it's the project team's estimate. So, from the perspective of the objective of project success, how do we as individual contributors to that symbiotic team help ensure the success of all of those elements, including the cost estimate? So the first thing we have to do is answer some of these questions, and answers to these questions are going to be derived from the survey results and observations. But really, the first step we have to do is answer, when is an estimate done? When can we recognize a change for an estimate? The first step to answering those three other questions is answering this question. And unfortunately, the survey results would indicate that the answers to those questions vary as widely as the number of people who actually responded to the survey. And so we're going to kind of look into those a little more depth as we move on. So an estimate might be considered done when an estimator has completed all the necessary activities to identify, quantify, analyze, assess, and document the costs for a given project scope, right? We might consider that it might be done when it's then gone through that peer review, that project control organization, management review and validation. We might consider it's done when management as the owner or the client as a vendor has actually accepted that estimate for its required end use. We could also consider another perspective for done from the relationship of the owner-vendor contract bid award process. From that perspective, the estimate might be done when it describes the full price of the vendor's cost to the owner. And then it might be considered done when the owner completes their acceptance and validation of the contractor's pricing and then wraps around their own base costs, including overhead and risk. And then it might be considered done when the owner actually awards the contract to the vendor. A different perspective, but again, it's one we might have to consider from a, when does change happen? So typically, done should signify that no further changes can be made to the estimate as presented for the end use. We shouldn't expect any to happen, and they shouldn't be allowed. And so essentially sets the line in the sand to establish when the estimate will be considered data locked. And then that data locked estimate will establish that performance baseline and determine budget control. And that's the point that we're going to do all of our earned value management analysis. But before we've called it done, there may be aspects of change that might happen in that estimate due to that review and validation process, due to the fact that, things happen. We started out with the intent to do a time and materials contract, and then we said, no, we're going to do a turnkey contract. And so, change everything here in this estimate, please. And the gate submission date is 2 weeks from now, go, right? That happens. So there's, various things that can change before we actually even set that performance baseline. So what constitutes change? Let's go to first principles. The definition in 10S90 says a change is an alteration or variation to a scope of work and or the schedule for completing the work. Most often that's associated with contract change management. But again, if we're thinking about it in terms of any kind of deliverable, and the estimate is a deliverable to the project, then we're also talking about change in that perspective too. So what becomes apparent is there's really no distinct change management guidance defined for applying it to the cost estimating process. So we're going to kind of take a look at the change related issues, and then what we can kind of learn from contract change management. So 3 change related issues. And recall that we're talking about the end use of an estimate under consideration for these changes before and after data lock is the estimate presented for baseline definition and budget control and monitoring. So essentially a class 3 performance baseline release for execution kind of estimate. So what are the criteria for defining when an estimate is data locked? What is the definition for a change pre and post data lock? And how do we manage and control those changes in both scenarios? Those are really the questions that we're kind of trying to answer, because ultimately when we have change introduces uncertainty, it introduces risk, and the goal for quality estimating is removing or reducing the risk of the estimate being inaccurate or incomplete. That's the primary objective that we always have, whether that estimate is the schedule or the cost estimate, right? That because we want to know that when we get to the performance baseline and we're starting to measure ourselves, right, we want to make sure that our earned value management is telling us real and accurate stuff. So the difficulty is when different organizations set different expectations for performance and baseline and budget control. Ultimately, that point in time should define data lock. What's interesting is from survey results that this can range between FEL2, when we have overall engineering is approximately 30% complete. So we've got scope definition. We've maybe completed most of our preliminary engineering complete. And in some cases, and we go all the way up to FEL4, where our overall engineering completion is 100% detailed design complete and issue for construction. The contract is ready to be awarded and for procurement and construction. Those seem to be the 2 goalposts that exists as the outer bounding limits for when organizations in our profession say, I'm data locked for performance baseline. So the difficulty is, trying to figure out, the difficulty for the estimator in this regard is from the fact that these different extremes exist. And of course, you're going to have different very distracting. A lot of activity happens between FEL2 and FEL4, and to progress the maturity and development of the project. Those at the FEL4 end of the spectrum, they're going to face fewer changes both before and after estimate data lock, and the likelihood of cycling through potential scope redefinition is lower because we figured out what the design solution is, and we're starting to issue awards. In those instances, where the scope is identified for change, the impact is also likely going to be less because the complete design is issued for construction. Those estimators operating in an environment where data lock occurs at FEL2, they're more likely going to see change with greater frequency and impact to the cost estimate before data lock and after data lock, because you're still progressing so much before and after from a maturity perspective. So whether we're defining a data lock target based on the organization's project lifecycle decision gates, or we're doing it on the basis of our contractual handoff points, it's understood that the implications of change occurring either before or after are significantly different for the project. So when we consider what types of tools and methods to be implemented, we've got to think about having different tools and methods for handling those changes as well. So before data lock, the change is as a result of the uncertainties due to the changing understanding of what's happening on the project and how and when and by whom. The estimator has to manage and control all of those changes resulting from these new kinds of inputs and revisions to the inputs through some sort of in-process version management mechanism. And really what the estimator needs to do here is track the assumptions that they're making to fill in the gaps and the risks and the associated uncertainties, because when they started building, they didn't know a whole lot. They're putting plugged assumptions that may or may not be validated as they progress through maturation. So making sure that they're keeping track of those assumptions is important. After data lock, we're now talking really about changes to scope, and really those changes should be tracked through a formal change management process. And this is the change management we typically understand from guidance like RP 100R19, and it's usually driven by scope or execution changes under contract. So the survey and the results. This survey went out at the end of November. It stayed open for about 2 weeks through to the beginning of December 2020. It was circulated to various AACE forums, the CII project controls community, the USGAO, and contacts within industry, as well as social media. The first 3 questions were quantitative in nature, just to kind of get a sense of who the respondents were. And the last couple of questions were really about the issues and recommendations they have with respect to change and data lock. So we had 31 respondents. These were the questions. What's your cost engineering discipline? Tell me about your employment. Are you a vendor? Are you an owner? Are you a consultant? What's your primary industry? When do you actually lock down your estimates? What kind of experience and issues do you have prior to lockdown? What kind of experiences after lockdown, and what else could we improve to kind of mitigate those issues, and any other comments? And as you can imagine, questions 7 and 8 elicited quite a number of responses. So we'll get into deep dive now from the perspective of who these people were answering. Obviously, the number 1 percentage was cost estimators, followed very closely by project managers and project controls management. So from the perspective of those in cost estimating, they felt that when preliminary engineering is incomplete or not yet accepted as the correct design solution, you're left having to fill in way more blanks from the perspective of defining scope for quantification. The assumptions may not be validated by the final design solution presented by the completed engineering, and this presents a problem from the perspective of accuracy. From the perspective of project management, the fundamental reasons they identified for change before data lock: errors by the estimator, late inputs from constructability stakeholders, the quantity or equipment capacity growth, or the base project capacity factors for site locations or equipment and project scope. So where we had a historical benchmark that we then applied to the current project, and those factors were wrong. From the perspective of those in project controls management, they felt that the primary reasons for change were owner comments, or the business planning funding forecasts changed and they had to shift when they were actually going to execute, kind of changing scope, or they had scope creep as the primary contributing factors. When we're talking about the issues after data lock, the primary drivers of change by these three top responders were cost-cutting efforts by management and stakeholders, delay or prolongation of costs. So we planned the original estimate in 1998, and we're only getting to it now in 2021. And oh my goodness, the cost of steel and wood and everything else has gone skyrocketing. And yeah, invalid assumptions and incorrect pricing was another one. The optimistic pricing of vendors, vendors trying to underbid just to win the work, and then, oh, change, and we've got it, and you can't not have us here because you need this done, right? And discovery work during execution, things like unknown underground services, interferences affecting installation, labor, etc. Client-directed scope changes. This tool set, yes, I know it's got an approved design, but that design has it in blue and I want it red. Okay, new design packages because you want red paint instead of blue paint. Misalignment with operating and manufacturing, quality of engineering and project management at the time of data lock. So, from the perspective of employment, the largest contributor of respondents by organizational representation, professionals as owners, pretty much 39% of respondents. They were consultants. 10 of those people had direct responses as consultants, and a couple had other, but categorized this way as well. So 35% of respondents, and the rest identified as vendors. So from the perspective of this facet of respondents, the root cause before estimate data lock, from the owner's perspective, almost unanimously defined they defined the lack of scope definition through engineering as the major cause of changes affecting cost estimates. From consultants' perspectives, the fluidity and fuzziness, and that was actually a direct quote of the scope during the periods between FEL 2 and FEL 4, but they added some additional nuances. Rescoping as a result of budgetary constraints, poor quantification practices, owner comments and directed changes were also things that they identified. From the vendor's perspective, they were much more specific. They called out the lack of value engineering initiatives, or value engineering initiatives that were applied essentially for scope cutting purposes, when there were scope clarifications or omissions, poor estimating assumptions, and late stakeholder inputs as the primary before data lock changes. From the perspective of change after data lock, from an owner's perspective, scope increases. In fact, they called it chaos. That was another direct quote. Scope increase, chaos, discovery work, and scope creep. Lack of interactive planning sessions, stakeholder, specifically with respect to getting stakeholder verification of the estimate strategy, gaps in the estimate scope, and poor project team reviews, or poor design requiring drawing revisions. So, as project teams, we can't just throw stuff over the wall to the estimator and say, this is your job now. We really all have to own it as a team. don't just leave it to the estimator and the estimator's guy sitting next door to review the estimate. We own the estimate as the project team. We should all review it. Consultants identified the primary driver of change as owner-induced scope changes, execution or contracting strategy changes, lack of discipline with regard to analyzing change, poor understanding and application of the boundaries of estimate contingency, and inadequate assessment of risk and uncertainty. From the perspective of the EPC vendors, changes in the means and methods. When they come in with an estimate, they're basing it on their means and methods. And when we as owners come in and tell them to do it a different way, that means cost change. And as long as we're prepared to understand that and accept that, yes, absolutely, go tell them to do something differently. But we also need to consider when we're talking to vendors, we're talking to them because we think they can do the job better than we can. So maybe we should trust their means and methods and give them the information up front with respect to how we want them to do things so that they can incorporate that into their means and methods. So give them the information up front before the contract. So means and methods or equipment type by sponsors and division managers and production changes, cost-cutting efforts, delays, missing scope, invalid assumptions, and incorrect pricing, especially from either the owners or the subcontractors' terms and pricing changes. From the perspective of which industry they supported, primarily the utilities and industry energy at 32%, transportation and infrastructure at 26%, oil and gas at 23%. Half of the remaining respondents identified themselves as EPC professionals supporting basically all of the listed industries, and the other half identified either as government, chemical, steel, respectively. By far and away, each industry said the primary driver of change affecting the cost estimate before data lock, the level of uncertainty stemming from vague scope definition due to engineering still being in progress, and afterwards, scope change. So from the perspective of what we can learn from the change management process is what is change? They have the same kind of 6-step process where we identify and initiate change. We prepare preliminary submittals. We then have a change order submittal. We have our approvals, rejections, change order execution, and claims. What we can take away from here is from the perspective of an estimate being produced for the project, we don't have to worry about claims yet. We don't have any recompense from the perspective of an estimator that, we didn't get the right scope from the project team. But what can we learn? From the perspective of a project management organization responsible for producing the processes and managing the estimating resources, we can learn that the estimating process procedures and tools have to be well defined and consistent across project delivery organizations within their companies. We also want to consider developing a standardized cost estimating input template that can be provided to the project management, engineering, and other stakeholders for developing the inputs that go to the estimator, rather than having the estimator review the whole scope of work and the PO and the contracts and interpret what you want them to understand. You translate that directly into an input template along with all of the assumptions and the date by which those would be validated, so that they have a standard view and they don't have to spend a whole lot of time reviewing things and maybe misunderstanding something. And it makes things a lot easier from the perspective of the estimate development and strategy kickoff point of view. That should be the primary place from which to start talking about the estimate. The other thing that should be considered is perhaps putting in place a comprehensive process for identifying and managing those changes during the cost estimate development process. So a change log, keep it up to date, keep it accurate, and keep it relevant with respect to your assumptions, because that's the part that's really going to change throughout the life cycle of the project. As you mature the project information, you can get rid of a lot of those fillers in the gaps, because the gaps are now filled with the right information. And then developing an estimate change dictionary. So that could define both the types of allowable change and expected change, and when they might be expected to occur, and how you will handle them, and those which might not be allowable. So as an estimator, if the schedule has been updated with some additional activities, I should expect that during the period of time before the contract's been issued, I'm going to get that information given to me. And so I'm going to have to incorporate that. But let's say the contract's been awarded and now we're changing strategies. That might not be allowed. So we're going to have to do some kind of assessment and a project change request to assess and validate whether or not that should be absorbed into the estimate. I recently completed a class 4 feasibility estimate where we put down specific expectations as to when we would change or not change the estimate for the client. So we said, this is a class 4 estimate. We're going to get our inputs from engineering and we're going to put those in. And if after your review, you maybe change where some things are going to be located and maybe change some equipment or change an equipment type, and that changes the engineering inputs to the estimate, as long as those changes fall within such and such bounding limit ranges, we're not changing the estimate because you still fall within the estimate class requirements. Why cycle, right? So having that written down makes sure that all of the stakeholders understand expectations, and you have a much more seamless transition back and forth. So and this is an example of what that estimate input template looked like. It was not very it was not very complicated, and it made it much easier for the discussion between the estimators and engineering as to what was going to be going in and how it was going to be quantified. So let's talk a little bit more about questions 7 and 8. The following slides represent the key summary points from those individuals who provided responses, and their recommendations for how do we actually solve the problem. So get agreement on the detailed scope before the cost estimate is locked down. Get construction team involved early on with regular reviews during the design phase. Get greater clarity and definition in the scopes of work in the tender descriptions. Often as owners, we are not very good at getting our scope written down in the RFPs because we know what we want. And, the project team knows what we want, and we don't necessarily translate that well onto paper. And then we hand that scope of work document over to supply chain and they throw on all of their T's and C's. And again, what we actually want as a technical response might get lost. Ensure all project stakeholders follow well-established processes. Ensure estimators have the right skills and qualifications commensurate for the size and complexity of the estimating deliverables they're responsible for producing. So, don't give your junior guy the complicated mega project estimate and, a month to get it done. Maybe parcel it out to, the electrical estimator for the electrical portion and the civil estimator for the civils portion, and have a managing team to kind of pull it all together and do that quality review. Work to integrate the estimator into the project team as a critical contributing member. Again, when it comes to understanding how the estimate and schedule tie together, any changes in durations and schedules and shift patterns and productivity factors that the estimator is making assumptions on are going to affect the schedule and vice versa. So making sure those two at the very least are locked stepped, with each other, and perhaps your risk person to make sure that all of that stuff is absorbed in both of those tools, very key. Work to integrate the estimator as critical, so they understand what's going on and where you think you're going to take things. You know, if you've handed over that T&M plan for contracting strategy, and the very next day you're sitting in with, you know, the rest of your project team without the estimator who's busy plugging away quantifying, and you say, you know what, let's go with a target price, they're going to be out of lockstep. Work to improve the client and stakeholder expectations and knowledge regarding the cost estimating process. If it's a class 2 estimate, it might take longer than a week. So understanding how long that's going to take, you know, so that you can reverse engineer when you need to start, you know, socializing the inputs to your estimator, will help everybody on both sides of the table. Again, differentiate between a control baseline and the approved funding limit for spending. Those are different things. Um, Develop some cross training between estimators and contract management, because oftentimes, if estimators don't understand the nuances of a fixed price or a target price or a turnkey or a time and material contract, they are not going to quantify that appropriately in your estimate. Perform an independent assessment of the value of scope changes and validate the accuracy with a stakeholder who has the authority to say no. And utilize some standard work packages with proper coding, and collaborate the estimate review challenges sessions. Um, the change management process needs to be clearly outlined in specifications, and do not uh, the process needs to be user friendly and real time, and should not require a lot of administrative support. Do not shoehorn the estimate into a falsely prescribed capital budget from the owners. And by that, we mean producing a class 2 estimate at, you know, 31 million, when really the estimate is a class 4 at 54 million. Just because it, you know, is you're being asked to produce something in a certain way. If you can't get there from here, don't, because all you're going to do is put the project at risk. And that both from a project team and a project estimator point of view. Ensure the appropriate contract model is in place to minimize scope and execution changes in the contracts. Ensure we've got proper estimating resource allocations against the estimated workload. You know, if you've got 30 estimates due in this month and you've only got 3 estimators on staff, you might be understaffed, and all you're going to end up is getting some crappy estimates because those guys don't have enough time to do what you need them to do. Better risk analysis and contingency forecasting. Risk is often a vitamin type of activity. Very little attention is given to assessing and analyzing our risk until something goes wrong. And proper contingency forecasts keep your stakeholder informed with risks and opportunities along the way, and allows for better portfolio management overall. Teach project management teams how the estimating process works and the interdependencies between PMT, engineering, and project controls. Accurate tracking of change. Fundamentally, the quantities of hours and dollars to allow reconciliation between the original estimate and the final cost, to allow calibration of our estimates, or at least your production factors. Remember, when we're talking about variance analysis, we're not just talking about variance analysis between the estimate we produced today and the estimate we produced last week. We're talking about variance analysis between the estimate we produced today and the original estimate we produced right at the beginning, because that's really what we want to kind of understand and calibrate. If we can't get it right at the beginning, and that outer box at the beginning, and change the makeup between base cost and contingency to base cost and contingency when we get to the end, we haven't done something right. We need to lock down our engineering deliverables, uh, and allow the estimators to do their jobs. So we have to set a line in the sand for when we're going to freeze the design for the purposes of developing our estimate. And then making sure that we have a better understanding of the concept of estimate accuracy, better focus and implementation of estimating uncertainty evaluation, especially for risk analysis. It must include an assessment of our schedule risk that also translates into cost risk, and improve the use of our reserves for potential cost scope growth or other changes to key defining assumptions as we progress our project characteristics. And then just making sure that we have better risk aware analysis after sanction. Remember, the impact is greater than the sum of the changes when we get after sanction. So establishing some change KPIs, sort of like days to disposition, capturing change in a database to allow for meaningful use of the data. Especially in the nuclear world, we're so good at collecting data. We've got data everywhere. Our problem is we don't put it all together so that we can accurately read the data and then get the data to tell us how to get better. We're very good at collecting it, but not very good at assessing it. So getting it into some data tools so that we can actually start building and planning better later. Otherwise, we're just continually planning for mediocrity. And then finally, risk and change management should be locked at the hip during execution, because most trends are the manifestation of risks occurring. So in conclusion, the scope, our understanding of scope is a continually shifting target as the project team moves through project planning and execution. Until the scope is fixed in contracts and design documents, the estimator needs to expect that change is going to happen. So the documented recognition of what constitutes normal process change and what doesn't, and developing some easy to use estimating change management processes that are rolled out and accepted by all of our project stakeholders are going to help everybody in the project team. And in this regard, the cost estimating professional has to take a page out of the guidance provided in the change management community and kind of seek to translate some of that process workflow into the cost estimating production process so that we can enhance our deliverables and how we develop those deliverables. And that is it. So I will stop sharing.
It's all gone quiet now.
It has all been quiet.
There's been no questions posted on the chat board apart from Gaith went here on the difference between funding limit and control baseline, thumbs up. So if you would like to ask a question, either type it in the chat or put your hand up using the reactions raise hand feature, or just wave vigorously in the video camera. Mr. Moreira, off you go, sir.
Well, hello, Shoshana.
Hello, Jim Marie.
So I appreciate the great presentation, by the way. I just want to say that first. But I did have a question on the last part of your presentation where you talked about, if there's a change and there's an impact, but you can absorb it, you're not going to change the estimate, right?
Right.
So we've all been on projects where we all have these changes that are these small things, right? But all these small things tend to add up, and they add up to a point where a change is needed. Do you cover the process where these small changes turn into a change once you amalgamate them?
Right. So again, the important point is to assess at the outset the potential impact of that change, right? So if it's a small change and the impact is minimal to the project, it falls within your risk tolerances, and those are important elements to define and describe and document at the outset in your estimating development plan in, as part of your estimate development strategy, you would say, this is, this is the objective for this estimate. This is what it's got to do for us as a project team. This is where it's going to be used. This is what it's got to look and smell and feel like. And this is how we're going to produce it. And this is what's going to happen when things kind of shift in terms of our understanding. So in the case of this particular feasibility report, the the client came back and said, we want to make a couple of general arrangement drawing changes, and that included changes to physical walls, the type of equipment that they wanted and the number of equipment. And when we assessed all of those changes, the puts and takes to the physical walls kind of evened out in the end. So again, from that perspective, no change was necessary. The change in equipment type, the pricing was comparable. So we said no real need to change there, but there were quantities that changed. And so what we said was, at the outset, before we even started estimating, we said, if this project is going to have, it was a class 4 estimate we were producing, and so we said the range, allowable range is this according to AACE. So if the change is within that range, then we're going to not make a change to the estimate, because we've already included estimating uncertainty, and that will adjust. Yes, absolutely. The estimator still has to verify the backup data provided to make sure the project team didn't falsify information.
So, Shoshana, you're sweet out the question, right? So a question from Alex, right?
Yes, there is a question from Alex. For the estimating input template, would you expect the estimator still has to verify the backup data provided to make sure the project team did not falsify any of the information on the template to reduce the cost estimate due to budget restrictions? So let's be clear. Changes
never happens.
yeah.
I think Mr. Hindle might have something to say.
So
whatever do you mean?
So, but that's a very good point, because obviously, as you can see by the responses from industry, that happens to us. We have, we start a project and we have certain expectations about what we're going to do and how we're going to achieve it, and what the organization expects of us. And then, something like, we had to derate because nobody's using their air conditioners, because they're all outside walking because they're getting sick and tired of sitting inside. These things can happen, and or we're not making as much money, we're reducing our operational costs, whatever it may be. The organization only has so much money in their wallet, and so they want to get everything done, but they need to assess whether or not it's going to happen, right? I want to get my kitchen done and I want to get my bathroom done, but what's more important to me, and what do I need more? They're both functional, but people see my kitchen more than they see my bathroom. That might be my objective, right? But I don't have budget for everything. So what in my kitchen is important? And so I'm going to talk to my partner and I'm going to say, I want to get, this fridge and this stove and this, counter. And then eventually he comes back and he goes, you're dreaming, because we don't have that much money. And I didn't win the lottery this week, right? So, okay, so the counter is not going to be done this week. And maybe we won't get that kind of fridge. Those are all scope changes to what I want to get done. And, I've given him my list. He's just changed it on me. We both understood what the scope was. It was a kitchen reno, and I'm kind of being silly about it. The fact of the matter is, even though the estimator is getting that template, you still expect the estimator to read the scope documents, to read the contracts, read the schedule, be sitting in those planning meetings, so that they so they understand what the project team is planning. Because even though they're getting that input table, that's going to help them be a little faster and understand what the engineers' expectations are. But the project is more than just the engineers. It's also the planners. It's also the construction people. It's also the project team. So all of that has to get rolled in. And understanding what's in behind that template will help um, uh, the estimator fill in the other gaps, right? The engineering input is really just about equipment, but how that equipment is going to get put in and what the schedule is all comes from the project team.
Hey, Mr. Morrison, you have your handy pandy up. Off you go.
Evening. Thank you, Rob. Hi, Josh.
Hello,
Well,
hello.
just to jump on Alex's question, I just about fell over when I read that because that exact same situation happened to me not too long ago. But I think instead of say falsify, I think it's more like a peer check where project teams can easily make a mistake too. So it's not necessarily to falsify, but to do that check. But I guess going back to my question, but thank you, Alex. That was a good question. My question was, when we went through the slide and we talked about done, and done, I almost typed into the chat, the answer is never. So the day after you do an estimate, there's always going to be some kind of a change. So my question was going to be, as part of your analysis and going through and taking some of this data, did you do any, I'll call it analysis as to where the effort versus reward kind of lies? And I'll give you the example. So we do a class 3 estimate and we get some more information as we go through. Our standard practice would be, let's collect that information and we'll incorporate that to our class 2 estimate that we do at the next CD gate. We wouldn't go back and update that class 3 estimate a number of times. But I guess my question was, when you think about that value or the level of effort to go and update that estimate versus the I'll call it the reward of tracking it as a change, it's good to understand where it is, and just wondered if you put any thought into that.
Yeah, absolutely. And the answer is the end use is going to dictate that that reward factor, right? If the input is updated, to, let's say, a class 2 level of maturity, but you are only required to produce a class 3 estimate for the particular end use. And remember, we're always talking about done for the purpose of the end use, because you're absolutely right. It's constantly evolving and it iterates. And the only time an estimate is done when the project is complete and we've got actuals, right? That's when it's done in reality. But when we're talking about it from the perspective of end use, so I'm going to that gate so that I can get sanctioned to the next gate. I'm going to the next gate to get sanctioned for execution. That's what we're talking about. That's the done. And if we look at the change and we say, this is going to make or break me actually being able to produce the estimate for my end use, I need to incorporate it. But if it's not, I can hold off and wait until the next one. Absolutely. Right. But when we're talking about going to execution, there's generally no estimate being done after you've set your performance baseline, unless you are reforecasting because you've gone so far off the rails, or you're producing an estimate to incorporate a change, right? So from that perspective too, you might consider the estimate done. We oftentimes don't re-estimate afterwards, unless we're doing a check estimate again to sort of see, this is what we said and this is, where we are, that kind of thing.
Oh, that's awesome. Okay, thank you, Josh.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Scott. Any other questions? Rush, you're waving. Off you go, sir.
Yeah. Hi, Shoshanna.
Hi, Rex.
So my question is on this AACI 18R 1997 about the cost estimate classification. And I think we had some chat about this one. So this particular RP is for process industries, and we are applying to the nuclear.
Correct.
Okay. So we are expecting something for nuclear, definitely.
Well,
So
Rush, I'm so happy that you brought that up because RP 115R-21, which I'm a co-author on, is the estimate classification for the nuclear industries, and it's out for public review right now.
okay, sure. I'll look into that for sure.
Yeah,
Uh,
but you're quite right. We use that, and
mhm.
it's problematic because although um, although the general guidance is correct, the real issue is, and particularly in nuclear, um, the ranges are not necessarily accurate. And unfortunately, we do a disservice to ourselves oftentimes because we're comparing when we're looking at it from the perspective of moving from one gate to the next. Oftentimes, organizations say, "Okay, well, what was your variance from the last time I saw you at the last gate?" But that's not really how AACE talks about it. They talk about it in terms of when you produced your first estimate, that class 5 estimate, now what's your variance between this one at this gate and this one at this gate and this one at this gate? And that's what those ranges are really relating to. And when our friend John Holman, and he looked at the energy industry, not just nuclear, but
Yeah.
Canadian industry, and we are really bad at our variance analysis, particularly on the top end, where we're sometimes 200% over
Mhm.
our class 5 estimates, and I've seen estimates where we're 300 and 400 over. So in 15R 21, we've actually realigned the ranges for the estimate classes correlating to nuclear, and we had international input. So Canadian, US, Italian, Russian, French, and there was one other. We had a global input to sort of rationalize those ranges.
So that new RP has taken care of the project maturity definition with reference to those inputs to the uh, estimating in the energy industry or a nuclear industry. Whereas
Correct.
current definition of project maturity is purely based on, like example, I am developing process flow diagram or not, but how does it applies to nuclear actually?
That's right.
So
So we also updated the project maturity and deliverables matrix to actually account for deliverables and activities that happen in nuclear. 18R97 has no discussion about licensing and regulatory requirements,
no,
which have, everybody who's ever dealt with the regulator knows that licensing and regulating requirements have lots of uncertainty in terms of cost and duration, right? You don't
right,
know
right,
when you're going to get that approved.
yeah.
And you don't know how many resources are going to be applied to the report to iterate through all of the comments. And so all of that has been included in the matrix now for
Uh,
115R.
Okay, good. Second question is about same 18 or 97 actually.
Yeah.
Is it for, I believe it is for Greenfield, or does it for, I know we are applying for Brownfield actually, but there is a vast difference between Greenfield and Brownfield. Well,
Yeah.
Brownfield is like you're not discovering scope, like actually, you're just, it's a sustaining type of a work, but it's not that you're, as a Greenfield work like.
Yes. Hello.
You were muted.
Sorry.
H&R does not specify whether it's a greenfield or brownfield use applications, but you're right. It's much more cleanly applied, if I were to say. when you're applying it to a greenfield project where it's brand spanking new and you're starting from scratch and you're building something somewhere. But again, the rules and application of rules still, I think, hold true. 115R21 makes the distinction that that RP is applicable to new build and modification nuclear projects. So we've actually made that definition. There's actually another new RP that's out for technical review. It hasn't gone to public yet for maintenance and turnaround estimates, because those are different. And the way that you produce them and the level of effort and the estimate maturity requirements are different for estimates for maintenance and turnaround, because you know a lot of what it is you're already going to do. It's not new. But from the perspective of, say, our industry, where we treat maintenance maintenance work like projects, and we don't use the same resources every time. We don't necessarily use the same contracting and execution strategies. We don't necessarily do them at the same times. I think from that perspective, our industry is still within the realm of reasonability applying 18R97 to our maintenance projects, because we don't do them the way, you know, the rest of the world kind of deals with them.
Yeah, okay. And then last question is like, does it justify like for the, I called NOAK, and this is when or input terminology is nth of a kind. Like, so if I'm doing a repetitive work, like a repetitive project,
Yes, yeah.
does it really justify to start with a class 5 actually, assuming that I don't know scope actually starting from this, you know? The reason for that is like, you know, because either they are not getting a proper scope and the estimators have an opportunity to say that, okay, you know, we didn't have a good scope, but that's not the case. Like, you know, you're doing it, if I'm replacing pump like 15th time,
Right.
why am I starting with class 5 actually, truly speaking?
Right. So again, in some aspects of those nth instances, you know, you could consider the full sum of n as the scope of work, right? And when, you know, ideally that's what you would do. You would you know, develop the scope of work for the complete cycle and then kind of break it out. But we don't do it that way. Oftentimes we do it, you know, on that individual basis. The issue is there are always, again, when we're talking about our industry, we don't use that nth time isn't always in the same location with the same resources at the same time, you know, and that can have some class 5 elements to it. But you're right, the scope of work, what it is we actually want to do, can be very much you know, a class 2 kind of thing input, right? The issue is when you take the sum of all those parts in aggregate, you might not be all the way at a class 5, but you're certainly not all the way at a class 2. You're somewhere.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
Definitely.
and then
that's true.
and it's understanding where it is you fall in the spectrum to make that real classification with some certainty, right? Because it's all about, you know, the uncertainty and risk profile of it, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Shoshanna.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So Melissa, was it worth skipping out on Ask Me Anything on the CEP?
Definitely.
I get to ask a question. I'm excited. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? I don't see any other questions, Shoshanna. So thank you. You know, good luck with the presentation. I've just gone brain at the conference, virtual conference in June.
Yeah.
Obviously, any feedback you want to give to Shoshana on the content, then please do that directly. I just wanted to mention one thing from a section point of view. We are going to be running a CCP course. I'm just sharing my screen here right now on the for certified cost professional between on the weekend of the 29th and the 30th of May. So the information is all published on our social media, but it's here as well. It's registered up until May the 9th. You can register for an early bird fee of $350 for members and $400 for non-members. So and then after that, it goes up a little bit. So please, if you want to come along and get your CCP preparation course undertaken, then let us know. If you this is as I said, this is available on our social media, on our LinkedIn page, and soon to be on our website. But we're having a bit of a technical challenge with our website, and we'll get that fixed as well. So just wanted to share that today. Apart from that, I'd like to thank Shoshana for her time tonight and for presenting to us a very interesting subject. And I think you tweaked a lot of interest in the people here about why we do what we do. And there's a lot of questions of, it's interesting you surveyed the world, right? You surveyed the people to find out what happens. Sometimes we don't always listen to what happens in what to us every day. I think there was a couple of questions there and a couple of probably nodding of heads that said, yeah, that happens to me, especially the budget constraints and the and all that stuff, right? So that force us into a box that we don't want to be in, and it makes it very tough to manage that going forward. So thank you. I'm not going to delay people's evenings tonight. I'm just going to let you get on with your evenings. I will be making a link to this from a video point of view. I have taken some screenshots, so not very flattering ones, but they are screenshots of tonight's session that we'll be posting to recognize the event tonight. So on that note, I'll let you get on with your evening, and please have a safe evening, and we'll see you next time. Okay, thanks very much, everybody.